read that again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for taking me off mute, depending on where you are joining us. My name is Timothy Chi, and I'm the director for the Center for Chinese Research at the Institute of Asian Research in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I am pleased to welcome you to this, our fourth and final session of the 2021-22 CCR Symposium, Seeing Like an Empire, Chinese Political Thought and Practice in Changing Times. Our presentations today are by Professor Susanne Weigelin-Schwiedrzik and Professor Goldana Salamjan. First, I would like to acknowledge that those of us at UBC Vancouver are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. We are honored to live and work here. This symposium covers a wide range of periods and topics, from in the imperial period to Xi Jinping. We look at Chinese political thought through the lens of new sinology, by taking thought and experience from the last 2 millennia seriously in its own right, and putting it into conversation with 20th century political thought and practice in China and their further developments today. For those who wonder what the contemporary or policy relevance of traditional Chinese history might be, I refer you to the historical resolution of the 6th plenum of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which was passed in November 2021, and to the pronouncements of the core General Secretary Xi Jinping. Regardless of what we may think of official versions of political history, perhaps one point of agreement with the General Secretary is on the importance of studying history today. Our guest speaker for this symposium today is Dr. Susanne Weigelin-Schwiedrzik. She is Professor Emeritus at the Department for East Asian Studies at the University of Vienna and Program Director for China at CSA, the Center for Strategic Analysis, Austria. She is a corresponding member of the Academy of Science Austria and a member of its its Academy Council. She is best known internationally for her research on Chinese and CCP historiography, as well as on politics and memory in the PRC, with special focus on the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution. Recently, she's been finalizing a book on the history of East Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries, and has been quite active in public discussions on the changing role of the PRC in the current international world order. She teaches at the University of Vienna and the Vienna School of International Studies. Her talk today is How to Overcome Diversity and Create Homogeneity, the CCP's Current Minority Policies in Historical and International Perspective. She looks at the current minority policies of the CCP in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia in terms of ongoing academic debates in the PRC and the repertoires of historical as well as international experiences on which they draw. She argues that the experiences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I guess it has disillusionment as well, provoked a reassessment of minority policies pursued since 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. While Xi Jinping propagates the idea that economic development is not enough to prevent minorities from going against the Han majority, academics are still discussing intensively to what degree the creation of a homogeneous nation state is feasible, possible, or desirable in this multi-ethnic setting. This discussion can be traced back to the Qing Dynasty and went through several rounds of redefining minority policies during the period between 1911 and 1949. However, never before in history have rulers in China dared to impose homogeneity by coercion. Xi Jinping is the first ruler to attempt this. Our commentator today is Dr. Goldana Salamjan. She is the Ruth Wynn Woodward Jr. Chair of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Department at Simon Fraser University. She is co-director of the Xinjiang Documentation Project, hosted by the University of British Columbia. She is an interdisciplinary scholar interested in examining settler colonialism, knowledge production, and their relations to environment, racialization, and minoritization, Her research draws on her ethnographic work in Chinese Central Asia, particularly northern Xinjiang. Her research has been published in a number of major journals, from Central Asian Survey, Asian Ethnicity, Human Ecology, Made in China, Lausan. She's also contributed chapters to the book Xinjiang Year Zero and Afterlives of Chinese Communism, Political Concepts from Mao to Xi. At the request of our speakers, we will go informal today. And first we'll have Susanne, and then Guldana, and then Tim will moderate. So we have kindred spirits and we're ready to go. So Susanne, let us begin.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this generous introduction. And I'm ready to go. I hope that everything will work out fine and I can get my slides going. Here they are. And I thank everybody for getting up early if you are in Canada, for listening to my presentation. And for people who are in other time zones, it might not be in the morning, it might be in the afternoon, like it is in Austria, where I am at this moment. So today I'm going to talk to you about a situation which has been very much in the discussion recently. And so the starting point is, of course, the ongoing discussion on the situation in the autonomous region of Xinjiang. And of course, we have been discussing a lot whether or not the information we get from the region are right or not. And I think the other day I saw a very interesting documentation on the, I call them concentration camps in Xinjiang, by a very well-known TV station here in Europe, a German-French TV station called Arte. And they introduced several very interesting colleagues from China about the policies the CCP is pursuing in Xinjiang. And they didn't even try to cover up what is going on in Xinjiang. So I think there is no debate on whether or not our information is correct anymore. The debate is that we need to understand whether or not this case of extreme coercion that we are observing in Xinjiang is actually yet another case of human rights violations, or whether this is something special. And again, we also have to understand whether this is something special which only the Uyghur people in Xinjiang are confronted with, or whether there is something behind this that is not only true for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but also for other minorities in the People's Republic of China. Just to give you an idea that the argumentation that maybe Xinjiang is a very, very special case has as its most important foundation the fact that Xinjiang is a very, very big place. It actually covers 1/6 of the whole territory of the People's Republic of China. And it's not only a very big place, it's also a very rich place, although it is divided into a mountainous northern area and a desert southern area. I'm somehow attached to this place because I had the privilege of pursuing a research project in Xinjiang together with students from CCP University, who are all Kazakhs. You see them here up front. The people here on this side of the slide are actually people from Xinjiang County who collaborated with us, and the people on this side, some of the people on this side are people from CCP University, and we were trying to actually find a way how to ameliorate the procurement of health services to Kazakh nomads while they were actually nomads during the summertime. And it was from 2007 to 2010. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture is because it was this experience in Xinjiang that made me realize that the more than 30 years I had spent on understanding China before that project all had one deficiency, which is that I did not understand what it means that China is a multi-ethnic country. I always sort of reduced my observation and my analysis of what was going on to China proper, and just left out regions like this, beautiful regions of Xinjiang we usually do not see when we talk about Xinjiang these days. And we don't look at this part of China, but we look at Shanghai, we look at Wuhan, we look at Xi'an, and we look at China proper. And I learned from being in Xinjiang and from being together with Kazakh people in Xinjiang that this perspective was totally wrong. And I also learned that how difficult it is to change this perspective. And some of my attempts to change this perspective will be what I'm going to tell you in a minute. This is, of course, to show you that Xinjiang is actually not only a very special place in its countryside, but also in its cities. And it is a place that is extremely open and friendly to people from outside. I think I've never had an experience like this, as being incorporated into the place where I'm doing my fieldwork, as I had in Xinjiang. A very, very special experience. So let me tell you in which direction I'm heading with my presentation. I'm definitely not taking the approach to say, you know, this is just another case of human rights violations. And I'm also not taking the approach that Xinjiang is extremely special and that the kind of extreme coercion we are observing there is only a Xinjiang problem and not a problem of minorities as such in China. I will argue instead that we have to understand what is going on in Xinjiang as the tip of an iceberg of incremental change of minority policies, which have actually already started long before Xi Jinping came to power. It's not something that you can explain by Xi Jinping came to power and then everything was bad. As a matter of fact, this started in the early 2000s. And in order to make this argument plausible, I will try to present you with some recent statements from Xi Jinping on minority issues. Then I will try to introduce discussions among anthropologists to you to see and to explain how this policy that Xi Jinping is actually voicing has sort of a background in these discussions. And in this context, we will also look at the sort of historical references they make and the references to international discussions that they make in order to legitimize their arguments. So let us go and try to understand what Xi Jinping has been thinking about minorities recently. There was a very important meeting on minority issues in August of last year, 2021. And in this context, of course, the great leader of the Communist Party of China made a very important speech, as Tim has already told us that he always makes very important speeches. And as part of this important speech, he actually sort of came up with a number of demands that minority policy has to actually exhibit. And the first one is we want more exchange, more communication, and more mingling, which actually sounds really, really nice. You know, we don't want to separate people. We want people to be able to communicate with each other. And we want people to marry each other, no matter from which ethnic background they come. The second very interesting aspect, of course, is again, we want more modernization, which means although we are very much focused on stability in minority areas, we still think that, you know, if we go on with modernizing these areas, people will be more compliant with our ideas as, you know, than when they actually don't enjoy a better life, to make things, to express it very easily. And then finally, very important is that he talked about 共同体意识. 共同体意识, the development of a community consciousness. So this implies that he actually is prioritizing a new understanding of a citizen identity beyond ethnic borders. And he wants this, and he describes this as a community consciousness. So the community consciousness is not related to the community of Uyghurs or Kazakhs or Mongols or whatsoever, but the community consciousness is actually focused on the consciousness of the Zhonghua Minzu, of the whole Chinese nation, no matter which ethnicity you belong to. And this is sort of the precondition, this consciousness is the precondition for the creation of a community, of a Gongtongji. And he says in his speech, you know, only if we create a strong sense of community for the Chinese nation can we work up to the dangers and challenges that we are facing in the process of the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. So I think this tells us why he is actually coming up with these ideas at this particular moment, because during his speech on the 19th Party Congress, he said, you know, we are now sort of approaching the center of the world stage. And the last step we have to take is full of dangers and challenges, what he tells us in this quote too. And we have to unite in order to be able to overcome these dangers and challenges. And all the strange policies that we are observing, including his minority policies, are all policies that he and the people around him design because they think that the Chinese nation is facing these dangers and challenges, and that there is a great risk that if you make a mistake, this last final step you make before you finally, after 170 years, reach the aim the Chinese nation has defined for itself, the danger that you don't reach this final aim is very high, and that's why you have to go for everything, and you have to go for this kind of assimilation policy in concentration camps. So what are the kind of changes that are actually implied in these statements? So if we compare minority policies in a very, very, general way, from the time in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping took over and went for reform and opening, with the policies that Xi Jinping has been sort of advocating since the 19th Party Congress, we see some very major changes. And one of those changes is that since the reform and opening, the PRC pursued a policy of respecting and acknowledging differences. When I was in Xinjiang, actually, I met people from among the Kazakh community who would not speak Chinese. They didn't want to speak Chinese, and they sent their children to Kazakh language schools. But there were also, of course, people who wanted their children to go to university and things like this. And of course, they would go to Chinese language, mostly boarding schools. Very interesting in this context is, of course, that since the 19th Party Congress, I think the CCP has been very outspoken in saying, we actually want to reduce the awareness of difference, and we want to establish this community and this community consciousness. And the community consciousness is actually a citizen consciousness. We are all equal before the law, no matter whether we are Kazakhs or Uyghurs or Han Chinese or Hui, right? So this is a major change with respect to respect and acknowledging differences. And the second interesting change is the idea of the autonomous regions, which actually were regarded in earlier times as a very legitimate place where minorities could form their minority identity and could actually be separated from the Han majority and live their life separate from the Han majority. In recent discussions and in recent speeches by Xi Jinping, we see very clearly that the separation between the minorities and the Han majority are not longer seen as something that should be advocated. And when he talks about communication and mingling and things like this, he actually is advocating a policy of more and more Han Chinese entering minority areas, entering the so-called autonomous areas. And when he says that everybody is equal before the law, this would also imply that even in minority areas where members of the minority had a certain right to participating in politics, Once they are equal before the law, this would imply that they don't have any quotas, for example, as members of certain boards, of certain commissions, leading organs in the respective regions. And last but not least, I think was very interesting to observe that when we were sent to Xinjiang to actually do a project on how to ameliorate the healthcare services for nomads, well, the precondition for all this is that nomads can be nomads if they like to be nomads. So they can preserve their own cultural traditions, they can preserve their lifestyles. But now the idea is cultural assimilation. They want to diminish the differences and instead, again and again, they're saying this, want to develop this sense of community beyond ethnic boundaries. So what is the reason for this change in policy? So it seemed comparatively successful. Of course, we see that, already in the first decade after 2000, we actually observing more and more instability in the minority regions. Is it this instability that actually made this change of policy necessary in the eyes of the leadership of the CCP, or what was it? According to my readings and according to my discussions with people who actually take decisions on these minority policies, I've come to the conclusion that the very reason why this policy is so important and has changed so enormously is a debate on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which actually came to a first zenith in the year of 2011. And the discussion at that time concluded that there is one major reason, not the only reason, but one major reason for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And this was the erroneous policies towards ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union. This sounds very plausible, and I don't think that we, looking at the Soviet Union as a dissolution from the Western side, would say, okay, we actually came to a similar conclusion. However, it is interesting because up until the year 2011, common sense in China was that the minority policies of the PRC were actually very much a copy of the minority policies of the Soviet Union. And when they came to this conclusion that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was very much due to erroneous policies in the sector of ethnic minorities, then of course they were hit very strongly by the idea that the same thing might happen to the People's Republic of China. So the scholarly debate, which actually started around the year 2000 and became very prominent with several publications in the year 2004, is very interestingly a scholarly debate that does not primarily go into field research among minorities, but it does primarily go into historical debates. And very interestingly, the authors who write papers on these issues usually go back to the year 1911 and the Chinese Revolution of 1911 that brought an end to dynastic rule. And they go back to this situation because the Republic actually inherited from the Qing Dynasty a territory that was inherited not only by Han Chinese, but by a big number of so-called minorities. And in this situation, the new republic had to explain how this Han majority would actually live together with other ethnicities on the territory which they had inherited as a republic from the Qing Dynasty. And very interesting, Sun Yat-sen, who is usually believed as a very liberal and open person, he came up with this idea of Zhonghua Minzu, of this special kind of Chinese nation, which is actually a Chinese nation that evolved from the coexistence of 5 different ethnicities, Wuzhu Gonghe. And these 5 different ethnicities, will eventually become a united nation of Zhonghua Minzu if they accept the leadership of the Han nationality. This is the central idea that actually Sun Yat-sen voiced in this transition period between dynastic rule and the establishment of the republic. And the reason why he sort of was very, very convinced that Han leadership was actually the solution to the problem of multi-ethnicity was that the Han nationality had proven by its leadership in the Chinese Revolution that it was the most advanced nationality among the 5 different nationalities he was talking about. And as the Han nationality could claim to be the most advanced nationality among those nationalities, it had the right to claim leadership in this overall process of homogenizing these these 5 different ethnicities to this one Chinese nation, which he called Zhonghua Minzu. So the flag actually that the Republic gave itself at the very beginning is sort of a symbol of these 5 different nations. And it's very interesting. Don't think that the Chinese nation is represented, or the Chinese nationality, I have to say, is represented by the color yellow. It's not, it's the color red, because it is the revolutionary among the different ethnicities. And of course, the Manchus, they were the people who were the emperors before, so they're yellow, right? And the Mongols are blue, and the Hui are white, and the Tibetans are black. So when we look at these very interesting articles, we see that there is something missing. They go back to Republican times, they go back to the time of establishing the Republic, and they don't look at the period before the establishing of the Republic. They don't look at how the Republic was actually established as a measure to counter what had happened during the Qing Dynasty. But if we do look at the Qing Dynasty, it's very interesting to see that especially New Qing history, the colleagues from the New Qing history field, they actually explain to us that during the 18th and 19th century, the Qing Dynasty actually refrained from imposing a set of rules for all the diverse ethnicities of the empire. And they found a very interesting way to rule a multi-ethnic empire by establishing the so-called Li Fan Yuan. And this Li Fan Yuan was like a supervisory body that looked at the different places, at the different banner places where the different ethnicities actually lived, and they gave them the right and the duty to rule themselves according to their own traditions. And the Li Fan Yuan only had the sort of the duty by the central authority to overlook and supervise this. So some people say, you know, this is one of the reasons why this multi-ethnic empire could actually be a multi-ethnic empire for such a long time, because they found a very flexible way of treating the different ethnicities living on the territory. So we can say that, as a matter of fact, the Qing Dynasty is a model of unity in diversity, a pre-modern model of unity in diversity, while the Republican model of Sun Yat-sen is actually a model of gradual assimilation under the leadership of the majority of Han Chinese, which actually legitimizes its leadership by this majority, by its success, and by having led the revolution and ended dynastic rule, they can also claim moral superiority. Success and moral superiority are still very, very important for legitimizing the rule of the Communist Party of China, and of course also for legitimizing the dominance of the Han Chinese majority. So now let us go on and have a look at the sort of scholarly debate. And one professor who has been very, very active in making suggestions of how the minority policies in China should be pursued is Professor Ma Rong from Beijing University. who sort of started publishing his papers in the early 2000s, and who is very sort of representative of this strain of research that goes back into history and that goes also into international examples, which he thinks are good examples or bad examples. And one of the keywords that he has been using since 2004 is the keyword of the danger of politicizing the minority issue. So he actually calls for a depoliticization of the minority issue, and instead he wants to culturalize the minority issue, because he thinks that politicizing the minority issue is actually a very, very dangerous thing to do. And what does he understand under politicizing? So one of the key issues here is that ethnic diversity, according to his understanding of the situation, leads to a strengthening of the self-perception of minorities as being separate from the Han majority. So he thinks that politicizing the issue means that you sort of provide the minorities with the opportunity to develop an identity for themselves that is separate from the Han identity and would therefore be detrimental to establishing a common consciousness, a consciousness of community. So what is his evidence in this sort of argumentation? First of all, he draws onto the experience of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and he says that both these countries are negative examples of minority policies in a multi-ethnic state setting. And he says that the Soviet Union, for example, not only gave minorities a certain territory and an institutional framework by having them found their republics, and by having the republics sort of come together and building the Soviet Union, the union of Soviet republics. He said, well, the biggest mistake, of course, was that they also granted these republics the right to leave the Soviet Union. And most obviously, the Soviet Union entered dissolution when the republics declared that they didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. By the way, this is also what the provinces in China did at the end of dynastic rule during the revolution of 1911. They declared independence, and by this made the continuation of dynastic rule impossible. So interestingly, his positive example is the United States. When we read this article against the background of the Black Lives Matter movement of last year, we kind of think, okay, this seems a little bit strange, but he insists that the melting pot policy of the United States is a positive example, and in which sense of prioritizing national identity over ethnic identity. So you, according to his understanding of the situation in the US, you are always a citizen of the US first, and then you say, you know, I come from Europe, I come from Norway, I come from Syria, I come from whatever place, right? So this is for him the positive example. And he says, you know, if we change our policies, and he does argue in the sense of changing the policies of the reformant opening period, he says we have to change it into this direction so as to fulfill this, what has been going on in the United States, which is prioritizing national identity over ethnic identity. And how do we see that this is a very successful policy? We see it by the fact that nobody has ever said that he or she wants to leave the United States and form a separate country. So in terms of theory, he actually quotes Habermas. I think Mr. Habermas might be a little bit astonished that he is being used as someone who can sort of provide a theoretical foundation for what is going on maybe in Xinjiang. But Mr. Marung, Professor Marung, actually thinks that Habermas developed a theory in which he argued that a nation which does not exist as a nation can actually be created by setting norms And everybody who complies with the norms can be a member of this nation, no matter which ethnic or class status this person has. So this is actually a theory that Habermas developed for post-World War II Germany. He says the western part of Germany actually does not have any kind of, it cannot claim to be a nation because, there is the GDR on the other side of the war. So he says, but we in the western part of Germany, we can actually create a nation by setting norms, by saying we are democratic and so on and so forth. We're setting certain political norms and then everybody abides to these norms and then we have a new nation. And this is actually very interesting that Mr. Marung thinks that this theory can be applied as evidence for his argumentation. Last but not least, he also refers to China's Confucian traditions. And he says that Confucian traditions are actually traditions that advocate assimilation. He says that the Confucian tradition has helped the minorities to assimilate to the Han Chinese majority. And that for this reason, the idea of assimilation is actually part and parcel of Chinese tradition. And for that reason, it is very well legitimized. And in this context, he then develops the next argument, which is if we look at the Soviet Union, if we look at the United States, then we will have to understand that the system of autonomous regions, which was actually which has been applied in China since the 1950s, that this system of autonomous regions has to be changed as the minorities, as soon as they know that they belong territory, will definitely develop their own and separate identities. And once they develop their own and separate identities, they will come up with the idea that they can develop from originally being an ethnicity to becoming a nation of their own, because they have territory, they have their own culture, they have their own language. And these are the main criteria that Stalin actually defined for a nation to be a nation. So Marung says, the fact that we actually gave this territory to these different minorities is the biggest mistake we ever made, because based on this, they can claim to be a nation, and based on the idea that they're a nation, they can actually separate themselves from the People's Republic of China. So he calls for a change in policy, and says, if we have to change this hybrid system that the CCP has introduced to the country. On the one hand side, it has politicized the idea of ethnicity by following the Soviet Union example and giving territory to the different minorities. And on the other hand, they have still applied the idea laid down by Sun Yat-sen, which says that somehow, despite the fact that all these different minorities have different territories, which they call their own, we will finally become one homogeneous nation. And he says that this is impossible. This is impossible. So we have to change all this if we want to fulfill our dreams of finally becoming a homogeneous nation. And so he says, in order to resolve this problem of this hybrid system that we somehow installed in the 1950s, first of all, minorities have to be treated equally as Chinese citizens, which actually translates into we have to take all privileges away from them. Secondly, their rights to their territories have to be diluted, danhua. So we will not stress anymore, that they have the right to their own territory, which translates into, if we give them the territory, they also possess the the rich natural resources of their territories. And this is something that we Han Chinese living in places where we don't have these many natural resources definitely don't want. So we have to dilute this idea of own territory. And we do this, of course, by mingling, by having people from the Han majority freely and easily move into these territories, marry people of ethnic background from these territories, and by this reduce the feeling of separateness and particularity, which is actually this feeling for separateness and particularity is the basis for political privileges. And once you actually provide them with these privileges, they will ask for more and more and more privileges. And that's why you have to depoliticize the whole thing. Right? By the way, Mr. Ma Rong is a member of the Hui minority. So obviously the idea of Zizhiqu, of autonomous region, is of major importance in this context. Although I think it has not really reached the so-called West, and people have not really paid attention to the fact that this idea of autonomous regions has been disputed ever since it was introduced. And the first big dispute actually occurred during the 100 Flower Campaign. If you look at the books about the 100 Flower Campaign, which are either written by non-Chinese outside China or by Han Chinese inside China, you cannot find that during the 100 Flower Campaign movement, actually the minority issue was a big issue. And you really have to sort of go into the newspapers of the time to find out that this actually happened, and to find out. And the articles are extremely outspoken during the campaign against the rightist, which actually was the subsequent campaign after the 100 Flower Campaign, that the people who had actually criticized the system of autonomous regions were people who were labeled as rightist or reactionaries later on. And why is this so? Not because they criticize the system the way Mr. Ma Rong is actually doing it these days. They criticize the autonomous regions system because it did not comply with the Soviet Union system, in which the different ethnicities had their own republics, which could join the Soviet Union or retreat from the Soviet Union. The autonomous regions of the PRC do not have the right to retreat from the PRC. And this is the issue that was actually discussed during the 100 Flower Campaign, and which of course was later on criticized. And we always think that Zhou Enlai is such a benign person who always thinks, you know, who can always think up sort of wonderful solutions which are not so terrible, coercive, and things like this. This is, of course, also right in this heated debate during the 1950s, when he tried to calm down things and said, you know, what there are people who are very localist, you know, 地方主义思想很浓厚, you know, terrible. So people only think about, you know, that they have to do something for their locality, and they don't think about our great project of a socialist, modernized country. But then he also says, you know, we also have to 批判大汉族主义. Okay, so great Han chauvinism is also bad. It's really interesting that you don't see this word very much these days. But of course, Mao Zedong has always been known for criticizing 大汉族主义, and so did Zhou Enlai. But very interesting, he said, you know, we have to overcome 地方主义, localism, and 大汉族主义, to finally unite in order to build a modernized. I didn't know that he had used this word 现代化 so early. This is an article from 1957, and he used the word 现代化. He said, only if we join forces can we build a modernized and socialist country. And then he went on to say that only if we build a modernized socialist country can we actually be sure that no foreign power will ever be able to get into our country and colonize us again. So this is sort of, this idea of uniting is a very, very interesting idea, which is very close to what Mr. Xi Jinping says today. And he actually comes up with an argument which seems very interesting and somehow contradictory to the idea of Zizhiqu, of autonomous region, because he says, you know, the ethnicities in China have always lived together and mingled with each other. They were never separated from each other. That is the reason why we don't need to have republics. Whereas in Tsarist Russia, they actually colonized the areas which are now republics. And in order to decolonize the areas, Stalin and of course Lenin before him had to provide this opportunity to organize their own republics. And then they had to decide all by themselves whether they wanted to be part of the Soviet Union. And then of course they can also decide whether they want to retreat from the Soviet Union. And he said, we don't have this problem. We never colonized anybody. We never colonized anybody. And we are the victims of colonization. So we don't need to do this, right? And so very interestingly, he sort of tried to come up with an argument which is actually not used anymore because it doesn't really make sense when you provide separate areas for separate minorities, how you could sort of argue that these minorities were always inseparable from the Han majority. Anyway, in this discussion was sort of implicit for a long time, but in the year 2019, it was again Ma Rong who actually made it explicit, right? It was explicit, it was a very heated debate in the 1950s, then it calmed down for a certain period of time, excuse me, and then of course, one could, go into many, many details trying to find out, what happened to the Mongols, for example, during the Cultural Revolution. I'm not doing this at this moment here because we're running out of time, but I think it is very interesting that at least for the period after the Cultural Revolution, starting from the decision on reform and opening up until recently, the autonomous region discussion was implicit but not explicit, but since 2019 it's explicit. And finally, in August of 2021, during the Fourth Central Conference on the question of nationalities, a political solution was found to this more or less scholarly debate. And it's a very, very interesting political solution because it says the system of autonomous regions will stay unchanged. Okay, the debate is over. We will not change this, despite the fact that we know that it's very dangerous, but we will not change it because changing it might be even more dangerous than not changing it. However, the Fourth Conference also said that the unity of the nation is top priority. And then they say something very, very special, right? Only if the minorities comply with the idea that the unity of the nation is top priority, will they be granted the assurance that their autonomous regions can continue to exist. The moment we see that they don't take the unity of the nation as a top priority, then we will have to change this policy. Right. So this is a very, very interesting so-called compromise. And I think now even in the West, we have learned that we have to look at these wordings very closely. We should have looked at Mr. Putin's utterances much more closely than we did in the past. Then maybe we would have understood better what's going on in his head. So let's look at this wording and try to find an interpretation of this idea. So Mr. Leibold, who is of course very well known as someone who has been working on this also in a historical perspective, and Ms. Tao, they actually come to the conclusion that this compromise is a compromise between two institutions. We very often have this in the People's Republic of China. On the one hand side, we have a party institution, which is the Tongzhanbu, which is the United Front Department. And on the other hand, we have a state institution, which is the State Council's Ethnic Affairs Commission, the Guoyuan Minzu Shiwu Weiyuanhui. Right. And so the United Front Department pushes for prioritizing unity, and the Minwei, how it is usually called as an abbreviation of this long name, the Minwei pushes for prioritizing diversity. However, we must not think that these two different organs have totally diametrical ideas about minority policy. Because if we go back to the founding of the Republic, and if we compare what Sun Yat-sen said, for example, with what Zhou Enlai said, and if we compare what Zhou Enlai said with what Xi Jinping said, it's very interesting, although we would put them into different drawers in terms of their political standpoints, they agree on one thing. And this one thing is that they want a Zhonghua Minzu. They want a homogenized Chinese nation made up of all these different nationalities, or whatever you want to call it. So this is very interesting. According to what I can read in scholarly debate, as well as in political documents, I come to the conclusion that the elites in the People's Republic of China agree on the overall aim of homogenizing the multi-ethnic nation with the aim of establishing the unity of the Chinese nation called Zhonghua Minzu. What they do not agree upon is which measures to take. Do we take the autonomous region away from them? Is it more dangerous to take the autonomous region away from them? Or is it more dangerous to have them live in autonomous regions and then develop the idea that there might be nations that have a right of sovereignty, right? So they are very, very split about which measures to take. However, according to my analysis of the situation, they agree on the overall aim. And the fact that we have still a scholarly debate going on where people say this about Zhu Zhichu and other people say that, in this case, I could only introduce Ma Rong's ideas to you, but there are still many people who actually go against Ma Rong and who do not comply and who do not stop criticizing the policies that have been adopted recently. The fact that this discussion is still going on is a sign of the elite not having found a consensus on which measures to take in their minority policies. So to come to an end, what does this mean for Xinjiang? I think that we can say that the ongoing extremely coercive policies implemented in Xinjiang are, as a matter of fact, an outcome, a very extreme outcome of this policy of assimilation aimed at the homogenizing of the Chinese nation. And as we see, for example, in Mongolia, they're now talking about having Chinese as the main language in schools in Mongolia, which of course also goes into the idea of homogenizing. They say, you know, everybody in this big Zhonghua Minzu has to speak the same language, because this is what you read in Stalin. Stalin says a nation has to have the same language. So of course, Mongols have to speak Chinese, Kazakhs have to speak Chinese, Uyghurs have to speak Chinese. And only if they speak Chinese, then they can actually mingle to become a more homogenized nation. And with regard to their cultural particularity, which Ma Rong actually wants to preserve to a certain extent, okay, they can sing Uyghur songs and Kazakh songs, you know, they can have Mongol theater maybe, you know, but once it comes to, you know, doing business, going to school, you have to be fluent in Chinese. And I think what we can actually already observe in Xinjiang is that once this policy meets with resistance, the leadership of the Communist Party of China will go to extremes to actually implement coercive measures, because they think that they are justified in doing this. And this brings us back to the very beginning of my presentation, when Xi Jinping said, you know, oh, there are so many dangers and challenges, and we have to unite in order to be able to actually work up to these challenges. Okay, if you think that the Chinese nation has this overall dream of becoming, you know, finally reaching center stage in the world, then this aim justifies everything. Unfortunately, communist politicians have shown time and again in the history of communism that if once they establish an overall aim, everything is justified. And I think the way how we have to understand what is going on in Xinjiang is, on the one hand side, this idea of homogenizing, on the other hand side, the resistance of the people, especially the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, against this, and then legitimizing every kind of coercive measures, because the aim of the Zhonghua Minzu is much more important than any aim of the Uyghurs. But as the elite has not reached a consensus on whether or not coercive measures will be successful, we are being informed on what's going on in Xinjiang. This is very interesting. Under usual conditions, we would not be informed. Of course, the fact that the Xinjiang people is actually resistant against these policies, the fact that the Xinjiang people is very well organized internationally also helps us to understand. But as long as we only had information from Xinjiang people, from Uyghur people coming in, there was still the narrative saying, you know, all this is not true. But eventually, the people from the Han majority leaked information on the fact that this is true, right? And this shows us that they are unsure whether or not they're actually pursuing the right kind of policies. And this is the reason why we know about what is going on. And this is also a reason why we should support the resistance against this kind of policy, at least by making all these things that are happening in Xinjiang known around the world. So I come to my final conclusion. As a matter of fact, I was kind of shocked because I saw that Xi Jinping is using nearly the same kind of vocabulary when he talks about the world at large and when he talks about his own country. When he talks about the world at large, he says, 人类命运共同体. So he talks about the global community of a shared future. It's a very bad translation, but this is the kind of standard translation that we use. And when he talks about what is going to happen in China, he also talks about 共同体. And I think this tells us yet another reason why we need to watch very closely what is going on in China in terms of minority policies. Because if we want to anticipate what might happen to the world if China enters center stage, and if the world comes under Chinese leadership, there's only one real indication which we can think about in trying to anticipate this. And this is the way how the CCP rules the multi-ethnic state of the PRC and deals with its ethnic minorities. And for that reason, I think the new sinology that Timothy is actually talking about needs to learn to really confront the difficulty of understanding the PRC as a multi-ethnic state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanne. That's a powerful lecture and a lot for us to chew on. I'm just scribbling down my notes. Well, we have, as I said at the introductions, and before we shifted over to our informal style, Goldana Salamjan from Simon Fraser University and co-director of the Xinjiang Documentation Project, for our commentator. And I know she's prepared some thoughtful reflections. So Goldana, please.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for Susanne for that great talk. Thank you for coming to the CCR event and giving me this opportunity to engage with this paper. This topic is absolutely timely considering the current ongoing internment and other genocidal practices happening in Xinjiang, language policy shift in Inner Mongolia, and the renewed cases of self-immolation in Tibet. So the historical context examined by the previous CCR events also nicely prepared for today's discussion and rightfully recentered the Minzu issues in studying China around the key questions on what, who, and where is China. As Suzanne's talks shows us exactly how the party state has been wrestling with these questions itself, theoretically and practical level, as the struggle of their own nation's self-identification. So in my comment, I'll first discuss a few things that's interesting that I've identified in the talk. Then I will talk about this issue about Minzu policy transition from my position as someone from the community right now targeted by the state violence in Xinjiang, and from my own scholarly interests around settler colonialism, indigeneity, and critical race studies. And then I'll end my comments with a few questions. So first of all, Susanne's paper contributes to this growing scholarship on how, in fact, Minzu issues is not marginal, but because they're minorities or they're in the remote borderland regions of China. In fact, Minzu issue is fundamentally at the center of China's existence as a nation. Dr. Wu Bullock, a very well-known anthropologist of China, he points out, he has a really interesting analogy of comparing to the concept of minority nationality, this 少数民族 idea, with Frankenstein's monsters. So the argument is that the concept and its accompanying social policy have become increasingly perceived by Beijing as a sort of threat, even though at first it was created by them by themselves in an effort to build a Chinese nation. And then this Frankenstein's monster has become a threat to the Chinese state and the Chinese nation. Therefore, on China's quest to become a quote unquote normal country that is not burdened by the institution introduced by the Stalin's nationality policy, the party must destroy this monster, which has not grown strong enough to attack its creator. Rodin also points out in order to do this, the party has introduced this ethnopolitics of fear that will undo its prior nationality policies and coercively integrate its minorities into the Chinese nation, and to join this grandeur project of rejuvenating of the Chinese nation. I think Susanne's work very well along this line, and it correctly points out what's happening in Xinjiang. It's not just a result of how well organized the Uyghur resistance is, or in today's context of this ideological debate. It's not something that will orchestrated anti-China agenda caused by the US and other Western countries. But in fact, what's happening in Xinjiang is resulted from Chinese party state's own urgent maneuvering in maintaining its own party's legitimacy and status quo. As Susanne correctly points out, the party state is actually actively working towards a solution to avoid the same fate as Soviet Union. In my own work from this, and in Xinjiang, and also other work I've been engaging with, I think this argument is particularly applicable to Xinjiang's case because of this geographical proximity to the former Soviet Union republics, and also the cultural, linguistic, and religious commonalities with current post-Soviet Central Asian People's State. So yeah, like as Susanne points out, the party have this compromise, and the final solution of still maintain the autonomous region as unchanged, but at the same time cultivating a sense of community as Zhonghua Minzu as being the top priority of their governance. Regarding to this ethnic politics from a historical and intellectual historical point of view, it's also worthwhile to point out the shifting usage of this concept Zhonghua Minzu, and pointing out that the interrelations to this construction of Han racial nationalism. Yeah. In fact, in Union of Five Races, Zhonghua Minzu idea is very much, as Susanne pointed out, it's proposed by Sun Yat-sen, or also Chiang Kai-shek. He introduced this into the Kuomintang's own ideology. And in an effort to, to stress this like homogeneous nation race in Chinese, 国族. And nationality question actually became a key debate, a key issue in the struggle for the power between the Nationalist Party and Communist Party. And as we all know, the Nationalist Party lost by, opposing differences, stressing nation state homogeneity. And the Communist Party won by granting the diversity and self-determination of the different nationalities. So, but it's also interesting to point out that, this 中华民族 idea was rejected by the PRC at first. In fact, in the early 50s, the term that more popular was 中国人民, the Chinese people, as the race, the nationalism was more considered the very bourgeois, like kind of more imperialistic, tendency. And the term was revived again after Mao's death to refer to the Han majority and the non-Han minority nationalities again. Here I want to fill in the space that Susanne left out by pointing out in 1988 actually if we trace back to the genealogy of this 共同体, Fei Xiaotong actually wrote this concept of 多元一体, plurality and organic unity. This term is still very Han Minzu centric, because Han Minzu was considered the coagulate core in which the other disparate people are active throughout the Chinese history were fused together as a 融合. So he actually came up with this 融合 idea first, but he also, really promoted the idea of the diversity. He said, this is the way how we can be like a multinational, multicultural nation. And then as Susanne was clearly delineated that the Xi's 共同体 was a much more coercive integration that's stressing on intermingling, communication, and this community is not really not on the level of consciousness, but also on the materialistic bodily level, right? That called to experience the honor and race together, to go through life and death together. So all of these seemingly innocuous and benevolent sounding terms, they have real lifetime impact in terms of policies, as we have seen from the leaked papers from New York Times, leaked papers obtained by New York Times. We saw that Xi Jinping's speech, secret speech, and his visit in Xinjiang in 2014, after a series of violent attacks happened, we really start to transition to this, from a more economic-oriented approach in Xinjiang to a more integrative centered approach to Xinjiang. So, the party's focus in Xinjiang work has really shifted from that, very, really, your important historical moment. And this was in the secret speech, and many of the work document that we have obtained and preserved at the Xinjiang Documentation Project. If you go to the Cadre Handbook, if you will also look at the recent leaked paper, that speech that given by Xi Jinping, the very, very key terms that he came up many times was 嵌入. So 嵌入 in English, embedding, right? So his approach is to embedding different ethnic groups into the common social structure and neighborhoods in the fields of education and employment. A very popular slogan that in Xinjiang, when I was there, it was virtually everywhere on the billboards and propaganda posters was all ethnic groups must be bound together like the pomegranate seeds. so these kind of policies have really been materialized in this very coercive manners through coming from the party's cadres. For example, like cadres monitoring villagers' life by entering their homes, live together with them, eat together, even sleep on the same bed, or imposing certain Han Chinese cultural norms and practices for their life. For example, make dumplings together, putting up Spring Festival couplets together, organizing certain Confucius adequate filial piety rituals, and so on and so on. So next, I want to move on to talk about the study of shifting Minzu policies by contributing my perspective as someone from the region, and also from a position of an interdisciplinary scholar interested in bridging critical indigenous studies framework and critical race studies scholarship to the scholarship of China. So I want to first talk about the global indigeneity framework. Suzanne's work rightly situated China's domestic policy into the more global picture of, for example, Soviet Union's collapse. So speaking of this, this scholarly debate about Minzu and its, the Soviet Union's example, I want to, to guide the audience into considering the positionality of these Chinese socialists, social scientists, and their problematic roles in applying Western anthropological knowledge in crafting the Minzu hierarchy and this binary of Han and minority, and this racialized relations. So earlier ethnologists like Fumaoji and Lin Yahua, they were educated in UK system in studying early version of anthropology, and to Ma Rong as someone, and the Huangang, for example, who have educated in US and then or traveled to US, and they provide a very crucial role, like as Thomas Mullany pointed out. They're not seeing like a state, they're seeing for the state. They're really like informing and shaping this public knowledge about social policies. And this policy have like real life impact on reproducing that racial paradigm. And from this point of view of settler colonialism, it also indigenize people, deprive the indigeneity and agency of people. So I want to encourage everybody to think about how does this traveling thoughts and ideology become adapted into the Chinese state's craft and governance, and how does this traveling model of settler colonialism become also become rooted and developed in China in its own way. So to follow up with what Suzanne has pointed out, the politicization and depoliticization of the autonomous region, and will, as in Ma Rong's point of view, will actually grant people more motivation motivation to become to participate in a Chinese national economy and become more identified with Chinese national identity instead of their ethnic identity. So I think this it's worth pointing out that these terms, depoliticization and culturalization, we shouldn't just take it for granted, but we should look at it from a more like a critical indigenous studies point of view by looking at like how this culturalization is not just like kind of a natural culturalization process that's happened with the consent from the people, racialized people, but it's more like in kind of a coerced, forced form of a synicization. And then his point of view of a culturalization of the non-Han people is also kind of leading to the leading to the consequences that making the, the differences between Han and non-Han people as simply just cultural instead of historical and political. Like Mark Elliott has this really good paper about missing indigeneity in China, the case of second generation policy. And he pointed out how this depoliticization is actually a de-indigenization of the people who actually have a very, very, cultural, bodily, spiritual, historical, political connection to the land, to territory that they are inhabited. So the depoliticization is getting rid of their political engagement with their land and resources, which Susanne also pointed out. But I feel like it will be a good addition to this this point of view. So, and this again, from the more practical sense that these changes are happening, these depoliticization and de-indigenization processes, particularly in Xinjiang, we see example from unfree Uyghur labor being forcibly mass transferred from their villages to coastal cities, factories, for example, in Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Or in my own studies, I have examined the mass displacement and removal of the indigenous pastoral nomadic peoples from their grassland into ghettoized, urban neighborhoods with state subsidized housing, with the premise that they're gonna have a better life that way. They can avoid harsh weather and painful seasonal migration from being Kazakh, being nomads, and so on. Another thing I want to really point out is the U.S. melting pot model that Ma enthusiastically promotes in China. The example he often used was that in the U.S., Black people and white people, despite the racial differences, but they still have this common nationality and citizenship. Besides this really uncritical application in China, without thinking how racial tension is in the US, he also ignored a very important aspect of the US melting pot is the erasure of Native Americans through US settler colonialism, because I think in Xinjiang's case, Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and so on, these are more comparable cases because of the unequal relations in terms of land reclamation, unequal relations caused by land reclamation, resource extractivism, racialized experiences between the settlers, hierarchy between the settler Han and the indigenous Turkic Muslim people. Right. So next I want to talk a bit about race, if I still have time. Race is so hereby I want to give a shout out.
You have time, but not a lot of time.
Not a lot of time. Okay, I'll be quick. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Cheng Yinhong's work, Discourse of Race and Rising China. What he argues that globalized China must address its racism problems. The party states always take the stance that China doesn't have racism problems, and because we don't have settler, we never did the colonizer. We were colonized by the West. We are the West, and then I think in the development of critical race studies in recent decade is that we really moved beyond talking about the West and non-West, Black and white, binary, or the really extreme cases, for example, extermination, genocide, Holocaust. But we're moving towards thinking about the more subtle forms of racism, and thinking about the other dynamics. For example, in China's case, it would be Han and non-Han. And we're also putting it into the context of globalization. I think this, in my own field, like when we address this topic about, you know, racism and racialization, minoritization in China, we're often getting this pushback by talking about that's ethnic. That's not ethnic issue. That's more like that's an ethnic issue. That's not racial issue, or that's more like you just don't know about the uniqueness of China's perspective. So there's this widespread China exceptionalism that when it comes to when we talk about race and racism in China. So I want like kind of engage with, you know, Susanne, but also like all the audience and the fellow China studies scholars to engage with these issues. As you know, Susanne correctly point out, this situation has developed to such a concerning degree to the human rights violation. And then we should, as Cheng Ying-hong correctly point out, that we must call a spade, right? To address these issues from the perspective of race. And in China's racism, the racism from, as you point out, the racism from with the more Chinese characteristics is very much grounded in this assimilationist logic. Assimilation logic that but still hold up the Han Chinese culture and civilization to the superior benevolent status. And a lot of the approach they were using is also like was inherited from the imperial approach. For example, like demonizing non-Chinese others, animalizing non-Chinese others, humanizing non-Chinese others. The humanizing part was more like pushing the others through humanization project while forever maintain a superior position in the social hierarchy. So we found the examples in terms of this everywhere in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia, through various social campaigns, for example, from anti-local nationalism, from the current poverty alleviation program in China, that's, you know, the party state takes this very benevolent, very, colonial stance of care, right? Caring for these people and lifting them out of the poverty, give them the sense of, to develop themselves and so on and so on. Or counterterrorism campaigns that demonize and criminalize and racialize Muslims.
Goldana,
Yes.
I'm afraid to say there's time constraints. I know you have much more and useful things to say, particularly on imperialization with Chen Guanqing's work. And I know you'll share it with Susanne. But I think it might be best if you turn to your questions, because I've got questions in the chat. But you've got good questions that I would like Susanne to have a chance to respond to.
Yeah, so I have 3 questions, or some shorter questions. I'll start with a shorter question. For example, when you were discussing the CCP, the cadres and the elites, and a lot of times I feel like there are a lot of these engaging with the Han or social scientists. I wonder if you have ever looked at the historical cases, for example, from minority nationality cadres, and what kind of role have they played in pushing back these very top-down ethnic policy transitions. And then again, because I was really a bit unsatisfied with the binary of Han and non-Han in the analysis. But I think rather than that, we can also kind of investigate the sticky nature of the term Minzu, Zhonghua Minzu, and this very shifty connotation in a different historical background. For example, Minzu in Chinese, it means nationality, like a people, right? Like 中华民族. But within China's context, when you talk about 民族 to people, all they think about is, oh, 少数民族 people, the 民族 dance, the 民族 literature, 民族 institution, 民族 education, 民族 this, 民族 that. They mean minorities. And a lot of so because of all the sticky terms, and discourses, and people who do not like critically, distinguish them, engage with them. So it kind of gave a space for, a lot of the cultural appropriation of minority nationalities' history to be incorporated into the history and discourse of 中华民族. For example, the term 民族英雄, right? A lot of times, like the non-Han heroes or legendary figures, for example, Genghis Khan would be kind of rendered as the 民族英雄 of China, because he was the one who conquered most of Europe and most of the world. So I wonder if you can also think in this direction of this kind of cultural appropriation through uncritical application of these terms. Could this be an evidence of how official historical narratives also erodes minority sovereignty and their cultural heritage? I think that's all. I just have these questions so far.
That sounds good. Those are good questions, and let's give Susanne a shot.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, and for reading my short paper so closely and for adding so many interesting aspects to what I had presented today. I think maybe we start with the idea of, what role do minority cadres play in the whole decision-making process and in remolding earlier policies or things like this. So I think it is very interesting to see that we cannot sort of delineate, here are the minority cadres and here are the Han Chinese cadres. The minority cadres are always on the side of those who actually want more freedom and more liberty and more autonomy for the so-called national minorities. And here are the Han Chinese who actually always want to intrude on the rights of them, what I call minority cadres. My personal observation in this context is, for example, I know people from the Minwei, and some of them are Chinese and some of them are minorities, belong to minorities. And very interestingly, my perception was that their understanding of the situation was more decided by the institutional setting in which they actually take decisions or advise the government, rather than their ethnic belonging. So it was very clear to me that the people from the Minwei, for example, are very much into diversity. When they interviewed me, they asked a lot about, language policies in Europe. They also told me that many of them went to Europe to go through training in Europe about language issues, diversity and language issues and things like this. So it was very clear to me already quite a long time ago that they had a very, very clear position in this whole debate, and that this position sort of coincided with the institutional setting, and it was this institutional setting which was more important than their ethnic belonging. On the other hand, I also have some experiences with ethnic cadres at the provincial level, and I must say that I was quite astonished that at the provincial level, it was quite clear that, for example, when we had to discuss a certain issue that was related to Kazakhs, we had Kazakh cadres at the provincial level talking to us. And as long as they talked to us, it was clear that we could go into the direction of, leaving allowing for the nomads to stay or to lead their life as nomads. Whereas then suddenly Han Chinese cadres came up and they said, oh, this is not right because we actually go for settlement policy and things like this. And then suddenly we were in a very difficult situation because, of course, we had made all our research in terms of nomads and their healthcare, and we didn't. Nobody had told us that there is a danger of forced sanitarization and then sanitarization, and then suddenly this came up, but it was not voiced by a Kazakh caterer saying, this is the problem here, and you're not supposed to go into this direction. Actually, it was a Han Chinese caterer who voiced this idea. And then the next year, when we came into the same setting, suddenly we didn't have any Kazakh caterers in front of us, and everybody talking to us was Han Chinese. Right? So, and then finally, I also know the situation a little bit at the very lowest level, and I was quite interested to see that the situation between Han Chinese and non-Han Chinese at the very lowest level was quite harmonious, to use this word. But we were shocked to see that, for example, the Chinese caterers didn't speak a word of Kazakh. Whereas, of course, everybody expected the Kazakh caterers to understand and speak Chinese. So, and even when we talked, for example, to Chinese professors who had done research into that in that Kazakh region for decades, and we asked them about a certain question related to religion, how religion and healthcare is actually related, she kind of looked at me and she said, never thought about this. She had been doing research in this region for more than 20 years. She didn't speak a word of Kazakh. And so I think this is very typical. And although it's harmonious, you can see very clear that there is a hierarchy, and that, of course, Kazakh people have to learn Chinese, but Chinese people never have to learn Kazakh, right? Even if they grow up in the region. I thought that was really, really strange for a European, I would say not acceptable. Okay. Then the next question was related to this Zhonghua Minzu, and the question, what is Minzu and what is Shaoshu Minzu, and how do we actually go about this, and how is this wording and the related historiography, if I understood you correctly, actually sort of aimed at sort of de-indigenizing these people, right? I think at this moment, it's very difficult to give a well-informed answer on this, because although I have been doing research in historiography for many, many years, I've only just recently started, together with one of my PhD students, to actually look in more detail into under which conditions actually, for example, Kazakh people or Uyghur people or Mongols could write their own history as Mongols writing their own history. It is really interesting to see how, especially the Marxist era, for example, if you look at Dian-Bozan, it's very interesting, how he on the one hand side describes in great detail how different these people were from the Han Chinese, but then he goes on to speak, this Marxist jargon, and then everything is reduced to, everything is class struggle and nothing is the question of ethnicity and race. And so I know that there is, like, for example, recent research by Julia Schneider on early Republican historiography on this issue. But I think we are kind of sort of growing into the 20th century, trying to find out, under which conditions actually the history could be written or could not be written. And that's why I cannot tell you a lot about this, only that it is really, really difficult to identify this on the one hand side, but then on the other hand side, we actually see that there is much more written on this issue, especially in the Republican era, than we ever knew. And we really have to do a lot of research into this direction. And I hope that my PhD student will actually contribute a little bit to this, and Julia Schneider is her second supervisor, so we are forming a team and we're trying to get deeper into this. In my presentation, I definitely did not use the word national minority. I think this is an inexistent word. And I think it is, you know, for people who are to a certain degree into language as we are, you know, everybody who does Chinese studies has to learn a language. And by learning a language, we should learn to be more conscious about the language we are actually using. And I think national minorities are a no word. And that's why I don't use it. And I try to use ethnicity as a comparatively neutral thing, because I know that in different political settings, you would use different terminology to actually talk about the same thing. And so far, I've come to this conclusion. I'm quite knowledgeable about the discourse on race in East Asia, because as Tim said at the beginning when he introduced me, I'm writing together with a Japanologist a book on history in East Asia during the 19th and 20th century. And of course, the racial issue plays an enormous role. And of course, when you look at Taiwan in ongoing discourses, you also see how the ethnicity and racial discourse is somehow very, very close to each other now, although it was very far away from each other in the past. Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Susanne. We have some questions, and I'd like to turn to them. I am struck that on each of these issues that are coming out of ethnicity and governance in China, we could do whole talks on each of them. I have a comment and a question from our colleague here at UBC, Liu Xin, and he says, thank you very much for this session. It's a very important discussion. Dr. Salamjan's reference to Fei Xiaotong framing Zhonghua Minzu as a 多元一体, as a Chinese nation, as unity within diversity, reminds me of similar tension in the framing of 一国两制. So one country, two systems. If the shift in ethnic policy identified by Dr. Weigelin is indeed happening, it seems we are really entering a new phase where ET and 一国, unity of the people and unity of the nation state, are trumping 多元 and 两制, diversity and two systems. This is a worrisome development indeed. I'm also interested in the increased prominence of the language of this Renlei, Mingyun Gongtongti, this shared language of shared destiny of humanity, whatever, that Susanne, that you mentioned. And he recalls that long ago, not too long ago, there was a revival of sorts of the language of Tianxia, Tianxia Zhuyi, under heavenism, or Tianxia theory. So his question is, the language of Tianxia still in currency, and how might it relate to these issues? I'll start with Susanne and give Goldana a crack too.
Yeah. Well, the language of Tianxia is, I think, becoming more and more important, especially when China tries to position itself in the world at large. But it is, according to my understanding, it is quoted, from ancient sources when also talking about the unity of the country. But it is not the word that everybody uses when talking about the situation inside China. It's more the positioning of China in the world. This is how I have perceived this so far. But with regard to 一国两制, I would like to say that it's quite interesting that here, of course, we also have territory, and we have autonomy, and we have preserving lifestyle as three elements that are integrated into the Hong Kong Basic Law. And that Hong Kong was actually guaranteed the right to preserve its own lifestyle for 50 years. Right? And so I think this is very interesting that this Basic Law was actually designed in a situation where assimilation was not the method to finally achieve this situation of homogeneity of the Chinese nation. So I would say the fact that Hong Kong needed to be reintegrated into China is a sign of the leadership of the time pursuing this idea of the big nation and the homogeneity of the nation. But very interestingly, at that time, the way they wanted to sort of design for this homogeneity to actually evolve from the situation of multi-ethnicity was not the coercive thing, but it was more like the Qing Dynasty, preserve the lifestyle. But they didn't say you have the right to preserve your lifestyle forever. They said for 50 years, right? So what we are seeing in Hong Kong is, from my personal perspective, totally in line with all the discussions I introduced today in my presentation.
Goldana, do you have some thoughts on this Tianxia and these changing framings of Zhonghua Minzu?
Yeah, I think Dr. Liu Xin's question is really, really relevant. Yeah, the equality has an implication in Xinjiang as well. This because like before, Han Chinese language was just called Hanyu, right? In school and in social interaction. But then, since this enforcing labor and mass internment, mass human rights violation and shift in Xinjiang work happened starting 2017, the language policy also changed. The language is now no longer called, Han Chinese language no longer called Hanyu, but Guoyu, to be consistent with what Susanne has been arguing about. They're really cultivating this like belonging to not just to their own language or their own land or territory or culture, but to the entire nation, China, to have national identity, right?
So they are even not afraid of taking over a terminology from the Kuomintang, of course, because Chinese, of course, and the Kuomintang is Guoyu.
Yeah. So I think this is also a really historical moment when nowadays we seeing more and more solidarity between the Uyghurs, people in Hong Kong, right, and people in Tibet. I think that they're facing the common struggles of being raised, their own cultural uniqueness. So that's what I think. And Tianxia, I don't think has a lot of currency in terms of the policy in Xinjiang in terms of political discourse. Probably more
for outside the Guo. There we go.
Yeah.
We run a flexible end time, depending on how questions and how others are going. I'm going to wrap us up. And I want to thank you both for a really rich presentation. I've got some takeaways. The leaders for statecraft, this has after all been a symposium on statecraft, Chinese statecraft in changing times. And I feel that you have fundamentally important contributions to that project of understanding it. One is that leaders, we see it once again in the Communist Party, leaders can agree on the goals, but disagree on the methods. And you think like, wow, well, that won't be so hard, except that that's exactly what the problem before the Cultural Revolution was. They're all gonna make communism come, and Liu Shaoqi had one way and Mao had another. And by that point, though they had agreed before. So it shows a continuity in governance style. And I very much appreciated the details about the Zhongshanbu and the Minwei. The two internal, we keep thinking of the Communist Party as a monolith, but of course there's internal divisions that are familiar in our own countries and our own bureaucracies. Second, borrowing Western thought for local use. We continue to see this happening. And of course, Susanne, in our chat before the session started, said, well, I could always go back to the Yuan dynasty. So borrowing foreign thought for Chinese statecraft did not start in 1840. And of course, Tim Brooke has been on this topic for a while too, as have others in the new Qing history. But you mentioned Habermas being used in a way that Habermas might not recognize. I have to say, there's another one we've run into recently, which is Wang Huning's use of Alan Bloom. I believe it's Alan Bloom. I get my Blooms mixed up. Or Harold Bloom, the American neoconservative. And in his Wang Huning's book, America Against America, he said, this is what, if Xi Jinping got the breakup of the Soviet Union as the lesson of what ethnicities and ethnic diversity did to the Soviet Union, the culture wars and weakening of resolve that Wang Huning saw in the 1980s United States when he visited. Who knew that the Politburo Standing Committee ideologists would use the Blooms of the American neoconservatives? So there you go. Borrowing Western uses of ideas for local use. And finally, you're telling us something about today that I think you give us deep perspective. And that is the move from diversity to homogeneity. Hence, of course, Suzanne's title. Boy, oh boy, this is not just a policy about Hong Kong or a policy about Taiwan. This seems to be baked in to the operating system update that everybody was given in 2017. And so with those worries, but also this deeper understanding, I'll wrap us up and thank you once again. And thank you all for coming. This is recorded and will be put up on the YouTube channel in due time for those who would like to revisit or point out to others. Maybe Susanne and Goldana can stay with me for a minute. We'll release the others to go to their days, to their dinners, to their lunches, as they may be.